Hello, everybody. I am over on YouTube as well today. Back up on that. I am not. I still have to get, I guess, a streaming key, and I thought I had a streaming key that it was going to give me, but it didn't. So I can't get my streaming key yet. So I should be able to do them both through one camera shortly, but we're not there yet. And so I am streaming from both now. I'm going to start downloading what I've been doing over the last couple days. It's come up on TikTok and transferred over to the YouTube so that people can find the old lives. Hey. And so I'm going to try and get that all sorted out within the next couple of days, hopefully. But we all know that I'm not great with time management. And an obligation makes me cringe. So, so I will be working on that. And then I'm trying to think. I think that's pretty much it. I am working on getting that streaming key, so I'm going to try and keep content a little bit less controversial. But once I get the streaming key set up and everything else, I want to talk some other things that we've talked about in the past, but we kind of stopped talking about because I was getting banned for them a lot. And so I'm hoping that maybe I can do it in a different way. And if I can do it through the other streaming studios, that it'll work better. Like it won't. And I'm hoping that I've matured a little bit in how I deal with people as well. So, but I want to make sure that I get that streaming key first. So after that, we'll be going into the start of Western agriculture again, and we'll be talking about science and medicine being indigenous and some of the ways in which we see that. And we'll be talking about, how that all ended and what we need to do to get back there. As we enter into Mental Health Awareness Month, I think it's extremely important for us to remember that this is not who we are. Well, I guess not enter into, we're like halfway through, right? This is not who we are. You are not innately evil. You are innately nurturing. You are innately communal. And you are innately curious, creative. And I want to say I feel, but it's not really feel. I see a lot of people really struggling with the fact that it's so hard to not be able to speak to people. It's so hard to, have to fit into a very narrow perception of what you are supposed to be, depending on what body organs you're born with and not depending on you at any point, right? And so I feel like I want to speak more to that because that's a big part of the things that we were talking about early on. And it's a big part of why paleoanthropology is huge to me, right? Paleoanthropology is huge to me, so much so because it shows the way that we as humans start, right? The things that are important to us, the things that are innate in us, the things that we value before we start valuing things that somebody else has told us to value, right? And so much of my paleoanthropology thought process goes with that. With that, I very much want to touch on some of those subjects. But today I want to touch on, kind of the few things that we know about how Europe was filled with people. And this would be migration. This would be settling in space. When we look at the Neanderthals and the end of the Neanderthals, and we see this around 30,000 years ago, you might remember if you were here yesterday, we talked about the fact that in the lower part of Britain, then ice started receding from that area like 27,000 years ago. So the first Homo sapiens that we see going into this space for many parts of Western Europe are after that end of that last ice age where it starts to recede, which is the same time that the Neanderthals are gone. So they're entering into this space after enveloping the Neanderthals within their society, as far as we can see within the fossil record and within the genetic record, kind of enveloping the Neanderthals within them, and they're moving into this space. Now we see that the movement into this space genetically always fluctuates. There's always fluctuation. And there is a small ice age that ends, well, maybe that's what they're talking about. Sometimes numbers kind of confuse me. No, it wouldn't be. So there is another like colder area coming through, and not like it covers everything, but it just gets really cold. That ends again about 10,000 years ago, that has kind of pushed everybody back down, and then they're going back up, right? And at least certain groups. So one of the articles that had come out recently is they can see that at the end of that small, I think they call it the little ice age, but I can't remember. At the end of that, humans are moving back up in, but not taking the same genetics that they'd had before. And they're looking at like the Solutreans on the Iberian Peninsula, because we see the Solutreans on the Iberian Peninsula at 27,000 years ago, right? So we do see in those lower areas of your Western Eurasia, where you have people who are already making it in, that are sapient, who are already making it into these areas, because we start this population of Europe again at 50,000 years ago, when we leave the Levant area for the last time. And so as we're going over, we're going this way, and we're going that way, and we're going this way. And so as we're crossing the top of the Mediterranean basin, we are coming over, and we have people that are in these spaces, and they go up to kind of middle Europe, because again, we do see that the upper portions are still in a very heavy ice age up until 10,000 years ago, right? So up in the middle, and as they're, it's coming down again, the cold is coming down, they're moving down, and then they move back up, and they see a replacement of the lines, the family lines in the DNA in one of the groups that they attribute the Solutreans to. The Solutreans, the Gratians, and the, I want to say Allegratians or something like that, but I can't remember what the third name is. And so we're seeing not only is there, this retreation and move back up, but when we're down low, we're mixing. And in this mixing, to me, one of the base understandings that I don't think people have is that we have always moved. It is what is unique about us as a species. We're basically fucking ants in the fact that we're constantly moving. We're constantly needing to do something. And we know this today in the fact that we know that exercise makes us feel better if we're sedentary, right? So we are constantly moving. We are constantly doing things. And so as we're in these lower areas, we're mixing again, and then we go back up. So as we're going back up in this last time period, and we're seeing the settling really of Europe, we're seeing that European nations that are forming at this time, and peoples that are forming this time, are sharing cultures in different places. This is things like the fact that we know that the DNA of the bell beaker in 3 separate places is 3 different kinds of DNA, and or family lines, and what we would consider ethnicity. But the culture, which is also a part of ethnicity, and we have to remember that, but not always do, is actually the same in 3 different DNA groups, right? So when we're looking at that, we're seeing that this movement, right? And movement up means that by the time we're getting up here, now first, we're coming out of the same place. We all start the same place. So our stories are all the same. In the base of our stories, in the base of us, there is a tree, and there is the world around us, and there are essences of us represented in animals, and essences of animals represented in us. And we see this in all of our early gods and goddesses. We see this in our gods and goddesses today. I was asked a while ago about whether or not how far anamorphic goes back. And I would state that I don't see this thought process is anamorphic. Anamorphic is imposing our continence on other things, basically. And I may be saying anamorphic wrong. But it is imposing our like, oh, that looks that animal looks like a human, right? Or that tree looks human, or we see that face in that piece of toast, right? Whereas this is a dualistic. It goes both ways. We not only see the earth in ourselves, we see ourselves in the earth, right? And it is really the fact that we see ourselves in the earth and we see ourselves in everything around us, and then we see them in us, that allows us to, like, it is that movement from seeing us as one with it completely, right? Not separate at all, to have a self, right? Into the idea that we have a self, right? That and that self identifies with the world around it as being a part of a whole. So that movement really is that start really of identity anyways, right? Like that goes back into that goes back, to that 90,000 years old first burial thought process, right? So when we're looking at that and we're seeing that, not only is it seeing us in the animals around us, but we're really seeing the animals in us and the earth in us. We're seeing that connection as a two-way street instead of a singular pathway, right? Or one lane road, right? And in that connection, developing out of it, we're coming from that because we're also coming from a space where we didn't think of the other species as any different of us, right? If we're enveloping the other species of human within us, then we don't see it as anything other than us. And as we're moving up and we're taking these different cultures with us, and we're constantly doing this movement and this morph, right? And this change and this adaptation. Because again, when we talk about being nurturing and communal and creative, and again, if you're new here, I get the idea that we are nurturing, communal, and creative because of the fact that we are all base scientists since our Homo erectus discovered and figured out how to work fire. We have the need as Homo sapiens, just as Homo neanderthals had, to obligatory midwifery, which is the need to have somebody present to help you birth your child because of the shape of the pelvic outlet and the shape of the baby's skull and the size. And we have 5 life stages, which is more than any other species on this planet. And all of our life stages are extended. We have 25 years from neonate, firstborn, to adult, fully formed brain. Currently, that generation is going to get a little bit less when our life cycles are less, right? So when we're looking at the fact that we have to have that nurture and we have to have that communal, and we are innately creative, right? We see that in needing to be a part of this community and not seeing anybody else as a different part of the community, as we're moving into these areas, we're also moving into the earth of these areas, right? And we're taking these gods and goddesses that we have seen throughout history as being our connection into these spaces and areas. I believe that the world tree is a representation that I have yet to find a culture that doesn't have some remnant of. And I believe that that comes from, so there are beautiful trees in South Africa and the southern part of Africa, where really nature provides everything, right? And so I think that that really, and if you're looking at those trees, you see so many different branches of nature within it, right? And every world tree has a different kind of concept behind it, right? It's not on every world tree that you see the 9 worlds. You see the 9 worlds in Nordic mythology, right? The world tree for Christ-based faith is the tree that Christ was hung on, right? The tree that Christ was crucified on, right? So the mythology of the tree is different in many different cultures, but the tree is there. And that means to me that it comes from the benefit of trees in South Africa and watching how the animals interact in the trees in South Africa, right? And as we're moving out, we're carrying this story with us, this history. Many people like to state that our oral histories or oral stories are more fallible, more faulty. And this is because they often think of it as a game of telegram, and it's not a game of telegram. When somebody is a historian in oral histories, oral story-based cultures. And the reason I distinguish oral story-based cultures is because history literally means written story, right? So it's like, that's the base of it, is that it's a written story. And that's why we add extra weight to it, right? So when we look at oral stories are passed down generation to generation with, you teach what your grandfather taught, or with like the Celts, they and the Druidic group would teach in 3-line stanzas until you got to know it, and then you moved on to the next, and then you move on to the next, right? So you're not teaching, you're not just learning a random story, you're not just hearing a random thing. You are in fact being a part of a generation of memory, right? Because you're being taught word for word the memories. Many cases with this, and you see this still today in elders and storytellers in every community that has that still, and there are many out there, not just here in the United States and Canada and Mexico and South America, but also many places over in Europe, also many places in Africa, also many places in the Middle East, really things like 100 Arabian Nights and the sagas and things like that are all documentation of these oral stories, right? So as we're carrying these out and we're moving across Europe, we're taking these traditions with us. And as we're passing these traditions down through the ages, we're separating into different groups. So really everything from like Middle Eurasia, I think, if I can remember correctly. Again, geography is not my easiest, but I have a thing that will show you like all the Indo-European languages. But all of them are Indo-European groups that are moving out and dividing into different cultures. So you see at this place that you're dividing into cultures such as the Germanic culture, such as the Celtic culture. And then, your Celtic culture might divide further into the Gaels and the Celts, right? Because the Gaels at some point kind of become a little bit more distinct, the Gauls, right? And so as you're seeing this movement through, you're seeing those roots being the same, that foundation of thought and animistic connection moving out with you being the same. I personally take my ancestry back. I try and take it back in each thing that I know, or like I knew only a couple of things when I was younger, and as I've gotten older and I've done my own research and DNA testing and all that sort of stuff, I've learned more, found a whole family, learned more, so as I'm looking at those things, I've started researching different branches a little bit more, right? But for me, what I have done personally, if you're taking it to a Lifeways, or if you're taking it to a Care for Each Other, or if you're taking it to an ancestry place, I take it to an animistic place. So when that group of people, most often it's when they were colonized, but when that group of people lost its animistic connection to the world around you, for me, that loss of that animistic connection is when we think we can own the earth, when we think that it's not just a part of us and a part of our biome and that we can own the earth. So I think as we're moving this, that as you push it back into those spaces further and further, you find certain things, again, that all connect. But I encourage to find, like if you know that you're Celtic from the Iberian Peninsula, and you know that you're Finn and you know that you're Germanic, right? And you know that you're Italian, right? So you can take each of those and trace them back to when they stopped following their animistic practices. For the Italians, is when Rome conquered, like it was for everybody else, because Rome conquered their own people first, right? So with that, you can see that each of them have this same foundation, but each of those foundations, again, has different outcomes, different stories that have come down. Now, this doesn't mean that people's stories have changed, right? It means that you have foundation families together. You have foundation groups together. And as those foundation groups disperse, and that's not the word, disperse across Eurasia, they take those stories with them. So if your grandmother had 3 sisters, and your grandmother and her 3 sisters all had 10 daughters, these are huge numbers, right? And then the next generation has another like 5 each, right? Say they have 5 and then they have 5 each, right? By 3 or 4 generations down, if you live in a tribal group, which is a group based on familial lineage, you're going to have like 40 or 50 people, right? Now, your grandmother sat at the world tree, and your grandmother taught her 3 daughters her view of the world tree, like the elephant and the 3 blind men, right? Taught her view of how the world tree came out. And she taught this view of how the world tree came out. Let's take this back Nordic. Maybe her world view coming out was seeing, wow, if it's up here, it's the sky creatures, right? This is all the birds. A lot of the insects are up here, right? And if it's down here low, you see that there's a tiger over here, right? And, maybe there's some jackals down around the root. And over here, you're getting some grass, and there's some snakes in the grass, right? And halfway midway, you got like all the baboons, right? And so grandma tells this story of the different worlds that she saw in the world tree. And her 3 daughters passed that on. Now, grandma's sister was sitting next to her, and grandma's sister was like, man, that tree just doesn't look like a tree to me. That tree kind of crosses, right? Now, this is absolutely not where Christianity comes out with it, right? But grandma's worldview is the execution of Christ, right? So this worldview gets passed down to her children, right? Again, that's not where that comes from. But each of these stories being passed down are being passed down intact and whole. Each of these traditions are being passed down intact and whole. Now, as they're moving out, and sis goes up here and sis goes down here, and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren pass these stories on, and you get the Nords and the world tree and Christianity down here. Again, not how Christianity came about. Then I just don't really know. I mean, I know there's other world tree legends, and I've heard some of them, but like I don't remember them as well, right? Because I haven't sat down. So but and some I wouldn't share even if I did, because it's not my place. But when you're looking at these different stories and you're moving within this different story space, you're seeing that in these different stories and in this pass down, you're also getting that interchange as the grandchildren meet back up, because you're also getting an interchange of culture. You're also getting this constant movement, right? This constant movement is how we don't speciate. This constant movement is how we're not becoming another species or multiple other species. We're evolving, but we're not going to be separate species because we are constantly interchanging. For most people, we think that before most people who haven't, really looked at movement before, there's the thought that people before, like for some, it's really like before Roman Greece, and for some, it's before 1492. For some, it's like there's like this thought process that there's no movement. And I want to stress that even in this movement, we absolutely see that there is a reverse of genetics from the Turtle Islands, from North America to Siberia. So there is a reverse, the X1 DNA coming to Siberia, right? So that is because you have that North Pole where you have islands you can hop if you know how to use sealskin and kayaks, right? So we see that there is this constant flow of information, this constant flow of culture, and this constant flow of DNA. One thing is you're looking back into the traditions of your ancestors, and you're going, say, to look at the Germanic people or to look at the Celtic people. Celtic people is a great example because it was kind of over TikTok lately. As you're looking at tracing back to Celtic groups, first you want to understand that there are many different Celtic groups with many different cultures that are still alive and still fighting colonialism today. There's a Cymru, there's a Kenrick. I probably said that one wrong. That's the Cornish. The Cymru are the Welsh, to most people's knowledge in the US, and Scottish. And Ireland, really, I still think North Ireland is still fighting for independence, or maybe it's South. One of them is still. So like there's this different culture in different spaces. And each of those holding on to their animistic traditions, Kennewick, oh, I think I got it. I think I associate Kennewick with Kennewick, Washington, which I associate with being Indigenous as a name. So I don't, and locally Indigenous as a name. So I think when I see Kennewick, it makes me think, and I probably am saying it wrong, and that's why, but when we look at those traditions and those cultures, we have to understand that among the Celts, there's still going to be many different traditions and cultures. You can't just be Celtic and have it be right? Or you can't just go, I'm Celtic, and think that you're getting to the root of what that culture is, right? So if you're like, I'm Celtic, and that means that I'm going to Seine, which is a water, and I don't know how to Seine, right? Obviously by that, but which is a water-based smoke cleansing that I obviously don't know enough. And you can't go in and go, well, this I'm going to do, and this is I'm going to connect to my ancestors. Because again, that's something, or that might be something that is unique to a specific group of Celts. To my understanding, that's Scottish and Irish, specific groups of Celts, right? Instead of the group of Celts you come from. So if you're working from a Pictish mindset, which the Scottish and Irish might be a root of a Pictish mindset, or it might be a Scotia root, and you are Parisi, which is near Paris, then you're going to have a totally different thought process of how to cleanse and communicate with your ancestors. And so if you're trying to talk to your ancestors are going to be like, I don't know what language you're talking in, essentially. This is important in your communication with your ancestors. It's also important in your decolonization thought process of trying to return to your ancestors' pre-colonized thought process, and of trying to connect with other Indigenous groups who are fighting for their land back, fighting for recognition, are having things used against them in shitty ways, right? Kinnuik. Jedi, not a lot. Okay, so where I'm from in the Pacific Northwest, most of our place names are actually Indigenous. We have a vast majority are actually Indigenous. We do have some that are like from colonialism, like Mount Vernon, things like that. And like our big landmarks and stuff like that are definitely named after European people, right? But like our towns and our roads and our rivers, a lot of times are named after different groups in the area, which is why in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of people will come in and they'll like, you say, well, Kennewick is one that they usually say differently. And then there's like, I have a list, like Walla Walla is almost always off, and Skagit is pronounced often Skagit. And these are all like local. Yeah, yeah. And I think with there, a lot of it, because it was colonized really like 300 years earlier was the final like colonization at the different coasts. It most of the names are of colonialists, or like they named shit after their lands at home, or things like that. Yeah. So I tend to think of most place names as being indigenous. But when we're looking at following our own indigenous heritages, wherever they may lie, it's really, really important that we are not taking from people that are fighting hard to be recognized as people on any level. Because that's, again, if we trace it back to the ancestral thought process of all being nurturing, all being communal, and always being interconnected, we would be treating each other with love and honor. And we don't see a whole lot of stabbing each other in the back, really, before we get to that idea of ownership, right? That's awesome, Sleepy. I know here we actually are having stuff like that happen a lot in the US lately, but we just had a mountain renamed. And like last year in the US, and I think parts of Canada, or maybe all of Canada, like anything with the slur SQAW was like changed. Like so many places where that river or that mountain, and all of them were changed to something. In a good portion of the cases, they were changed and named after people of indigenous heritage, or indigenous group names or things like that. It's a fight, right? It's a huge fight, especially since a lot of times they're named after the people that conquered, or the people that just did a lot of destruction, or their name slurs, right? That's awesome. So it's just, appropriation of other people's culture doesn't help anybody. And I always want to make sure that when we look at that, we understand that. And we understand that even if there's this constant mixture, that doesn't always mean that there's this constant cultural exchange. Because when we look at like the Bell Beakers, we see that there is this cultural exchange without a DNA mixture, right? So when we're looking at those things, we must understand, I believe, to move forward in the way that I believe our ancestors would wanted us to, or is honorable, is to make sure that we're honoring the groups around us and their right to that fight, and their supporting in that fight, or supporting them in that fight. I truly believe that unless you're like we talk about decolonization a lot, and it's become very much of a key, or not a keyword, but a buzzword, right? It's becoming very much of a buzzword. And when we're looking at decolonization, we have to realize that if you are actively occupying another person's territory, and your ancestry doesn't come from that territory, and you're still actively occupying it without working to ensure that they have control of it, right, then you're helping that colonial system. And so you can't decolonize unless you mix that search for yourself and your own ancestry, and decolonizing your own thought process and brain with actual action to ensure that you are helping groups in the area that you live actively take back control of their lands, or control. I guess that's not the best way to put that, because it's not necessarily control. For me, it's about governance intending. Control is just really kind of an easy word of it. But take back that say in their own world, right, and in their own lands, and take back the places that they were given to tend, that they're supposed to be taking care of, right? We've talked before about, to me, that is like the basis of how we solve climate change. Again, climate change itself is that cycle that comes with glaciation and deglaciation of the planet. But we see that the climate destruction that got caused from the very beginning with Western agriculture has kind of spread across the world as Western agriculture spread across the world. And to change that destruction and get us back to a point where, sure, there's cycles in land and we learn how to live with them, because that's what we do as a species, right? We learn how to move and live with the cycles of land. I mean, let's be real, we've lived through many, mass glaciation periods as a species. And in that time, and in that time, we've not only lived through it ourselves, but we've seen our other cousin species live with it and enveloped them within it, or within us. Neanderthals are 600,000 years on a planet, being twice us. So at that point of time, they've lived through so many glaciations, and we've enveloped that in us. With all of that, we can learn how to live, especially with the technology that we have, right? With that glaciation and deglaciation natural cycle of the earth. If we would just get back to that natural cycle of the earth. But we can see how returning that tending and governance and understanding and, teaching of how to work with the land to Indigenous peoples across the globe in their spaces, so that they can, show people in other spaces how to get back to that, so that we can, return to that space within. For me, I personally look at that tracing back, going back as far as I possibly can. To me, that's because I've always really connected to, I got out of the mountains and moved back in with the family that I had grown up with and my parents when I was 10. And at 12, I moved out to the edge of a reservation up in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a group that I hadn't grown up with. And I looked like this. And I never thought of myself as any different. But that's when I started getting told that I was a pretendian, and And I just said, okay, because I've always been the path of least resistance when it comes to ensuring that other people's boundaries are respected, right? And so I started studying other things. I studied Cleopatra because I was fascinated, right? I had studied nothing but Black and Indigenous history beforehand, and Irish history beforehand, and Nordic history, because my mom had said you should know all of your ancestors. The Nordic was way out here because she was getting finds that proved stories. And she was like, look at this. This shows that they had made it here, 500 years before Columbus ever made it here. I was 5 when I learned that, right? I stood up in kindergarten. But, when I was looking at those things, I went to Cleopatra because, that was just a fascinating subject for a 12-year-old girl. And then I went to the Celts, and I went to the Irish because I knew for a fact that we had Irish heritage, and nobody could tell me we didn't. I mean, it's OKC, right? So in studying that and in studying that specific ancestry group, I also was looking at different spaces just because I loved them and Cleopatra. And then I went and visited my grandmother, and she had this coffee table book on Neanderthals. And I knew, they said at the time that they were our predecessors, but that told me that they were us. And so this one is down in Spain, down in this, it's not Salutrian, it's a Gravetian. It's a Gravetian. It's not a skull. It's based on a find in the same culture that have the Venuses, the Wollendorf, the Venus of Wollendorf, and the other one, we've had it in here before. My brain is kind of scattered today. Sorry. Not just the Venus of Willendorf. It's on the website underneath early Homo sapiens. Let me pull up the website and I can tell you exactly who it is. Maybe if I can get in the website. But it's of the Gravachian culture. I think I want to say it's 20,000, but I can't remember if it's that or 15,000. 10. But it's okay, there it is. It's under the This Week tab. The Venus of Brassamphy and the Venus of Wollendorf are both associated with this one. This is a Gravatian. They didn't take this from an actual skull. They took this from the artifacts that they have. So they're talking about the genetic evidence within these, right, within this article. But they're also going into that replacement that we were just talking about. So when I was talking about the three Gravatian cultures, that they see that one has a replacement of DNA as it goes back up after the end of the last ice age. This comes from that. This is a rendition based on DNA and based on finds. So like the Venus of Wollendorf and the Venus of Brassamphy are both Venuses that have what we consider to be either a headdress or braids. And they're it's usually checkered, like cross-checked, and draped down. And Wollendorf's is scalp tight like his is, but Brassamphy is draped down. So it comes in both versions. And they're on most of the statues, we wonder if it might be like a midwife would wear it. They put it on a male because it's one of the representations that we have of what that culture looked like, and because they like men. We do have another rendition like of the statue itself that was done by, and I don't have it in my actual phone. I have it in my pictures on my computer. They have a rendition of the Venus of Brassamphy that Tom, I can't pronounce his last name right now because my head, like I said, is just not working where it's supposed to. Tom Borkland did. And the Venus of Brassamphy that Tom Borkland did, I think I have it. I thought I had it. Let me see if I have it. It's really beautiful. It's a woman, and she's dark-skinned and covered with the shell, like he is, the shell kind of head covering. They think in some circles that it might be a symbol of rank, of place in society. And because it's normally on statues of women, I do not have his one of that. I'd have to go through and find it. Because they think that it is, or because we see it normally on women, they think that it could be associated with like midwifery or fertility. Thank you for the spelling, Mia. So finding ancestry is really difficult and hard. Unless you're going to pay for it on some level, it's really hard to access a lot of things. It's really hard to get DNA on a lot of things, or get DNA connection on a lot of things. So when you're looking at, if you have any stories of family history, like we came over from Germany at this point, or we came from Ireland at this point, or, you know, the potato famine, or grandma was shipped over here as an indentured servant in the 1600s, right? If we have anything like that, that's my starting point for anybody. If you have that stuff and it tells you that you are indigenous to an area that you're living in, but you don't have connection to that area outside of, great great grandma was a princess in some nation, my suggestion is to look towards your European heritage first, or your came from heritage first, not here heritage first, wherever your here is, right? Especially in space where indigenous voices are loudly asking, not to. Again, when you're decolonizing, right, it's not just about decolonizing your brain, though that is really the main thing that you can decolonize unless you're living in an indigenous space that's your indigenous space and you've overthrown the colonizing government, right? Which most of us can't, right? If you're working on decolonizing, you need to do it more than just inside your head to really be decolonizing. But you are more than welcome to go to most local indigenous groups that I've known of and say, hey, listen, I'm an ally, I'm an accomplice, I'm working on decolonization and I want to help. I have these skills. What can I do? And I say, I have these skills. What can I do? Or I'd rather actually say, I have these skills. What can I do with them that you need? Or is there anything else I can do? Or, things like that. Always, going into a space that's trying to retain it or return to autonomy for themselves and their people, sovereignty for themselves and their people, asking what needs to be done as opposed to telling what needs to be done is healthy. And don't expect people to just know what you can do, right? It's easier for somebody if you say, I have these skills, or I'm really good at this, or, I'm really good at this. Do you think that could help you? Is there anything else I can do? Things like that, so that it's easier for them to decide what you can do instead of putting the weight of that decision on them, right? And that's really that. So one of the things that I came to TikTok to do, and one of the things that I really try and make sure that I'm working on as often as possible, is the fact that I was asked by several community members, because of the things that I study and because of the things that I know and because of the way I look, right, to help teach European Americans about decolonization, right, to help teach accomplices about decolonization mainly, because it's so frequently in activism communities, there are many people who are accomplices, like hugely valued accomplices, but they are trying to decolonize without appropriating other people's heritages. So how to teach decolonization without cultural appropriation was a request. And so that's one of the reasons that I come in. It's also like I said, my day's off today. And it's not always my favorite subject, right? Like, I know how I've done things, but I also know that not everybody comes to it with the understanding that I come from. And I also, no matter where I'm at, I'm always getting, why are you doing this? Like, and so it's my brain, but absolutely. That's awesome, Shanice. So if you have one space, you can start there, right? If you have that legend of one space, and again, if the only thing that you have is we were here, then usually there's going to be some connection, right? We are in a time when a lot of people are, claiming heritage that they don't have, and they're being called out for it. And so you want to make sure that you're not doing that, right? Because again, that's the same thing as cultural appropriation. It's not helpful to anybody. It's not really decolonizing. So if you're trying to decolonize, take it back to the space that you know that you came from. Like, not we were here, but came from this space. And if you have one, you can start there. As you move forward in your research and your studies, buy yourself a Christmas present sometimes or things like that, you can dig deeper. There are sites on my webpage where you can take like ancestry test results and stuff like that and get better results, better, deeper dive into what that states, because ancestry and the way that they do their testing and their genome, or not their genome, but their testing and their interaction of testing doesn't really give a whole lot of information that's right. But you can use that DNA test and take it to somewhere else, and they'll dig deeper into that DNA test than Ancestry does. So when you are looking at that and you're taking it back, again, remember that we do all seem to have a root, right? In all of our stories, we have the same world tree. In all of our stories, we have this connection to the world around us, the earth and the sky and the mountains and the trees. In all of our stories, there's some interconnection there. And in all of our stories, there's a connection and a similarity between us and the animals, because we see that we see ourselves in the animals, and we see the animals in us, and we see deities around us that take on both our characteristics and animalistic characteristics, or animal characteristics from certain animals in the area many times. And when we see that, what we're seeing is that shift in understanding and in that intermediate. And it's not like it was meant to be intermediate. I don't know why. It's not like it was meant to be intermediate, but it is that space between that sense of identity being a little bit separate from the world, right? Before this, when we die, we walk off because you're just another animal, right? Like I'm not seeing you as being imperative as much. Like we're still a group, but no, it's not that. I'm not seeing your spirit as a separate from your body before this. And again, that starts with burial about 90,000 years ago, right? So as we're moving into that, we're starting to, just like our first languages, adopt sounds from the worlds around us. Our first gods, our first deities, our first connections, our first intertwines, all adopt from the world around us. And so seeing that world tree take into all the different areas, that's a good one for you to trace. So my culture comes from the Celts, and the Celts have a world tree. My culture comes from the Germanics. The Germanics have a world tree. My culture comes from, South Africa. And South Africa has a world tree, right? So when you're looking at that and you're tracing it back in, I would definitely try and get it as narrow as you can of where that person was from. Like, so came over from, so if you say came over from Ireland, it's pretty narrow, right? If you say came over from Europe, where in Europe? If you say came over from Germany, then you're pretty Germanic there, right? If you say come over from France, then you could be Celtic or Gaelic, right? Which are both Celtic, but still, like, the Gaels develop their own cultures, right? And so you might want to narrow it down, right? So if they came from Paris, and they came from Paris, well, and see, that's the other thing though. Like, so they came from Paris to America, right? You can see the ticket, right? Then you want to look, like, what's their last name, right? Where does that trace to? But you also have to look at, like, okay, so they came to America from Paris. Did they come to Paris from Spain, right? But you can absolutely start with they were in Paris, and so I'm going to take it to the Parisi, the Gauls, at this point of time, right? I would dig myself to double check and double down, right? And some of it, you can get if you're going to local libraries and things like that for free. A lot of it, you're going to have to find some form of payment for to get into a website that gives access. WikiTree, and there's another couple that are on my site that will give you some access, right? It doesn't give you all the access, but it'll give you some access. So you can use them to get some of that stuff to trace back a little bit and to find connections that might be able to trace you back a little bit further. Once you can trace it back further, you can shift perspective if you need to, Or you can, you know, the grandfather came from Spain, but he married the grandmother in Paris, and you know they have been there for a minute. So now you have this, and now you also know Spain, right? And so as you're doubling it down or you're taking it further back, you're going to add different ways of connection. And by ways of connection, what I mean again is that we are nurturing and we are communal and we are creative, but those ways of connection are to the world around us for that community and nurturing, right? And to the people of our ethnicity, of our culture, of our stories, right? The people of our stories, right? And so when we're looking at it, you're going to find that there are distinct things here and distinct things here. You might blend these two things together, or you might use this distinct thing for this distinct purpose and this distinct thing for another distinct purpose, right? Things to start with. Almost all cultures have, like I said, a world tree. Almost all cultures have cleansing elements that relate to either air cleansing or salt cleansing. Is pretty cross, you know. Salt is actually like a subject of wealth for a long time. And so it's also a good barrier, like a good cleanser. So, and almost all spaces have the same archetypal peoples. Like, so, okay, you can see so many similarities between Thor and Zeus. You can see that there are horned gods in 2 or 3 different cultures. You can see a trickster in every culture I've seen. Every culture I've seen has a trickster god. You see that they almost all have protectors and defenders. And most protectors and defenders are associated either with the earth or the sky. You can see that most cultures have a fertility or a hearth or a home entity, right? And these are archetypes very frequently. So a lot of times if a culture has an archetype in what they expect out of people, you're going to see that archetype is very much within the goddesses, like, or in the gods. So if they expect those that they deem to be male to be, you know, very powerful thunder gods, right, that are out there sleeping with everybody, then they're going to expect that, you know, their highest deity is going to have lightning and out there screwing everybody and have half god children across Greece, right? So you're going to see that these things are either the things that we value the most or the things that we fear the most, right? So when you're looking at that, if you're not positively sure that, you know, your family goes back 100,000 years or 10,000 years in Paris, right? If you're not positively sure that you taking it back to the animistic thought process, it's not France, you don't know for certain, you know it's somewhere in Europe, right? You can use the things that are kind of common. You can use smoke cleansing from things that you can find everywhere. This means that you can smoke cleanse with rose. You can, lavender is pretty cross Europe, right? You can smoke cleanse with things like this and get that cleanse, right? You can smoke cleanse, like if you're like, okay, so I'm from Europe and I know it's Northwest Europe, you can research what kind of plants and what kind of trees are in that area and go, okay, well, that one, you know, is, you know, do a little bit of study. Are roses sorry, I had a name or call come in and it pauses my thing or turns off my sound. So you can look and see what plants are indigenous to the area that you're coming from, right? And then incorporate those by going and seeing, okay, well, we know lavender is really great for sleep, but what else is lavender good for? Or we know that roses smells great, but do you know that rose is extremely good for the skin, right? And you know that it's the cleansing elements of rose are highly important, right? And that you can eat it, right? So when you're looking at those things, you can incorporate things for different needs, right? Again, you want to make sure that you're incorporating different things that are coming from an area that it would likely come from, or it's something that's global, right? Sage is a pretty global thing, but white sage is from California. And buying bundles of sage in a store isn't healthy anyways, right? Like that's not good for the plant population itself. And it's also like you should never buy spiritual items like that. Especially not cleansing ones. Like you can cleanse some spiritual items that you have to buy, but some spiritual items like white sage aren't ever supposed to have money exchanged for them, right? So you can't, you got to make sure that what you're doing with sage is something that's a European sage, right? And you also got to make sure that where you get the herbs that you use for any connection, any ancestral process, comes from a space that uses some method of honorable harvest. The terminology on honorable harvest is Turtle Island indigenous, most especially verbalized in some of the books that I've talked about that talk about honorable harvest and how to go about it as we look towards indigenous voices on how to work with this. But it is something that you see globally in different indigenous groups, right? This need for honorable harvest. Again, this roots back in the idea that I am not separate from the earth. I don't own the earth. It's something that I'm a part of, and I should not take more than I need because everything else has needs too. And when I'm robbing other things' needs, it's not healthy. When I'm robbing the plants' needs, it's not healthy. To maintain a healthy biome, we contribute to the health of the entire biome. We're here to tend. We're not here to control, right? So honorable harvest is about ensuring that anything that is taken is not like you don't take all of the plant. You may take a little bit, or you only take a little bit. You communicate with the plant and you ask, I really need this to do this. Where would you prefer that I take? Just have a little conversation and give it an offering. I personally don't use things like tobacco, just because for me, tobacco has become so poisonous, because of tobacco companies. It's very hard to get non-destroyed or honorable harvest tobacco, right? So I, coming from a legal state, tend to use marijuana. Because I also can track where the marijuana is coming from way better than I can track the other things. With that, you can use various things, use a little bit of, rice seed or a little bit, because it's not going to grow at that point, but it's there, right? It's a love and it will nurture. Use a couple of herbs that you have already, use little bits of things that are of value. Use a stone that you found that you love and it's beautiful. And maybe, you press it to the root of that tree or something like that. When you're looking at those things, to use herbs that you can't get like that, like say there's no lavender or rose nearby you, right? You can absolutely grow your own when it comes to things like lavender and rose. You can also, you can go and you can buy bundles of lavender or roses from people that, like selling roses because that's from their garden or things like that, and use that. You can also use those that are given to you as gifts. So if somebody gave you a dozen roses as a gift, you can take that rose and, definitely give thanks to the plant and give thanks to the giver, right? But definitely give honor to the plant, and then dry it out and use the rose petals for that. And again, that's because, well, you can't trace the honorable harvest within that, right? Maybe they bought it at a store, you don't know. But it is a gift in that reciprocity is important, right? And so, and then of course, like I said, you want to thank these things. This is another thing, like, so like for me, it's really hard to eat things that I get from the grocery store because I don't know, well, in all too often cases, I do know how the animal was taken care of. And I grew up with honorable harvest for my meats as well as my foods. And so, or my vegetables. So I will thank what I'm cooking, or as I'm getting it prepared, or, send to the spirit. You can do the same thing with your plants. You can do that same thing if you have no other way to get something than that. Still, don't use white sage or buy white sage to use. As you are looking at smoke cleansing, it's one of those things that is used across the globe. Another thing is kind of building a barrier, either in your mind or with salt, or, some specific areas might do some specific things. Ash will keep snakes out of your garden, for instance, things like that, which you can find and you can trace. Absolutely. But when you're, or not, but, and when you're looking at that, it can give you ideas of how to set up perimeters around your house or to cleanse your house or things like that, along with any smoke cleansing that you're doing. Candles is a really good one because fire, in some sense or another, has lived within us since Erectus, right? Since before we were here. We are only here because Erectus had fire, to my mind. So that being the case, candles are a great source of fire. That is a safe source of fire. I always go for things that are unscented, just because for me, you can go with whatever sings to you. And that's the other thing. Things need to sing to you. As you're doing them, if something feels right, if something sings to you, if something seems like you should be doing it, then it's a good thing to continue. If it's something that you're like, oh, this is kind of weird, I'm not sure about this, then stop. Just stop. That means that your ancestors aren't hearing you with that. That means that your body doesn't connect to that. We hear a lot lately about epigenetics, right? And epigenetics is really your ancestry in your bones. It's your ancestry carrying over on your cellular level. So your ancestors are constantly with you. Your ancestors are constantly watching you, right? So when you're speaking to them in their language, when you're speaking to them in their the herbs that they use, the scents that they use, the sounds that they used, the tastes that they had, right? When you're speaking to them in their language, they will sing to you more than when you are speaking to them in somebody else's language, especially if you are trying to speak to your ancestors in ways that your ancestors used to kill people, or like taken from the people your ancestors killed, that incites a lot of bad juju. Or if you're using ways of people that colonized your ancestors, right? So maybe your ancestors are Celtic and you're using a Roman way, right? Like, so you want to make sure that if you are trying anything and you're like, oh, that doesn't feel right, you're like, okay, that's not it, right? And it's not demons, it's not spirits, it's not things like that. It's that energetic connection, that scientifically based energetic connection, right? To me, that's really what it is. We are all an energy base, and that's something that's proven scientifically. They've proven that everybody's energy affects everybody else scientifically. And as we look at this and we trace this movement of energy, right, that tracing of that movement of energy means that everything I'm doing is affecting everybody around, and everything everybody around is doing is affecting me on an energetic level. We have to sing to that energy to get that energy to work. We don't want to attract a bad energy, or not even a bad energy, but attract an energy that might be hurt, right? Or, we might have done, the energy that attached to us might have done wrong, right? So as we're moving through that, there's several different ways that you can do. The other things to look at are, we're looking at the end of stone tools in many spaces in Europe at the end of the Neolithic, which I believe is like 5,000, maybe it's 4,000 BCE, right? Like when they start metallurgy. And of course, they have metals before that, but they're just like you can find a gold nugget and pound it out. If it's pure gold, and it'll pound out because gold is such a soft metal. It's not like metallurgy, like fire and metal. But when we look at that start of metallurgy, you are going to see that shift from flint for the group of people that you're belonging to steel. Some cultures that metallurgy goes back a lot further within, actually some of their gods are very attached to iron. And some cultures, their gods are not attached to iron. So for some cultures, you're going to see that they'll have lots of iron in their home, right? Or iron at their door for protection. Whereas other cultures, iron blocks. So you wouldn't want to put something in an iron cauldron or, something like that. So as you're looking, that's another thing that you want to understand and look into. Glass is pretty much one of those things for Europe that's really universal. And glass is thought of as a conductor a lot of the times, or as like it passes through. So glass is something that is actually, something that if you're looking at European ancestry, using glass vessels is absolutely good. You can find actually like old style, Roman vessels or old style Celtic vessels or recreations from digs and stuff like that that can be really cool and fun. Another thing is pottery. That's pretty prolific in Europe. It's pretty prolific around the globe. Certain types of pottery are very unique to certain areas, like when we look at bone china and Asia, right? Or bone porcelain in Asia. See, comes from China. So when we're looking at things like that, we're seeing that some spaces develop different ways to work these tools than others, or patterning, right? So say that there's a bell beaker population in northeastern Europe. And say that your people come from that region of Europe. And you're like, well, the way that the bell beaker patterning is really, really cool. I want to use that as patterning on, something that I wear when I'm connecting to my higher powers, or something that I put on my altar, or something that I'm, decorating my body with, right? So you can also take and look at different artifacts that we see, that we've found throughout the world, right? And use those things and incorporate those things when you're worshiping or not worshiping, but communicating. I use a lot of words interchangeably. I also try and be as inclusive as I possibly can. So as you're communicating, as you're worshiping, as you're praying, as you're doing whatever that is you do to connect to that spiritual past, right? Looking at that, you can incorporate those different patterns, and it'll sing to your ancestors. It'll show them that they hear you better, right? They recognize it. They recognize you absolutely when you speak to them, but it brings them more into the world, if that makes sense. Like it gives them that pull in, right? It gives them that feeling of being alive, right? They recognize the surroundings so they can sink in and feel that, right? And so you want to definitely incorporate as much of that as you can. I think I'm going to go ahead and go today. I know today's live was very kind of small and very kind of disjointed because myself is disjointed. But I'm going to try and be back tomorrow. I've got some stuff going on tomorrow, so I will probably be early afternoon again. And then I'm probably going to be busy this weekend, but we'll definitely try and be back tomorrow. I did post a video today. I'm going to try and post more videos on every couple of days or every day as I possibly can. I'm trying to post more of certain content as well, and make sure that we are that I'm getting like different lists together and things like that, so that people have something for that, or like something that goes over all of Erectus or something that goes over all of Neanderthal. So I'm working on that as well. Again, sporadic as fuck because I'm here. Thank you, everybody, so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, so much for the day, and I will talk to you guys soon. This live is auto-streamed on YouTube. Again, I'm going to try over the next couple days to get everything switched over to YouTube from the last few lives on here. And I will talk to you guys later. Have a great one. Bye, YouTube.